So I'm going to talk about what does levelling up imply for skills. So this first picture shows a map of the proportion of people with post A-level qualifications in England and Wales. So that's usually university degrees. And as we've seen from other people's graphs, there's a concentration there in London and the southeast, and it's less prevalent elsewhere in the country. It's important to note that this doesn't primarily reflect how good schools are in different parts of the country, that educational outcomes is itself an output of different forms of inputs. So the most important thing that influences educational outcomes is actually family background. If people are not living in great areas, if they have good jobs, if they are living in poverty, it's very hard for them to provide the right environment for their children to thrive and to do well and to go on to university. So a large part of the reason why we see this sort of dispersion in educational outcomes is because of these problems, these other deep-seated inequalities that really we have to address if we also want to address educational outcomes. And these are things that need to be addressed through national level policies as well as regional level policies. This next picture shows the highest educational achievement of people by age 26 in a recent cohort, full cohort of people going through their GCSEs. And it shows that about 35% of people have at that stage just education up to GCSEs or perhaps lower than that or the equivalent. That there's a further about 25% who achieve at most upper secondary qualifications, A-levels or BTECs equivalent. And then there's about 40% that have tertiary education at this stage, which would be mostly university degrees. If I were to characterize the problems of England, is that we have too many people who have low-level qualifications and not enough people who have tertiary level vocational education. So we need to try to help enable people to reach their potential, to progress them through the system better, as well as to attend to the quality of education at every level. There's a particular issue with vocational education in that there isn't very many places that people can go. If they've done vocational education in college and they perhaps would do something else, there just isn't that much provision, despite the fact that there's actually quite high returns to the provision that exists. Regions are differentially affected by national problems, and post-16 education is a good example of that. Those with lower achievement often do vocational education and go to FE colleges. FE colleges are poorly funded relative to schools, and they do not have any pupil premium, which is very bad considering how many people with disadvantaged backgrounds go to FE colleges. There's also some important structural issues that post-16 pathways are complicated, especially if you're not on the academic track. And it's difficult to plan your way forward, to know exactly what you're going to do. Apprenticeship provision at lower levels has declined, and a degree apprenticeships is not a good substitute for this. The availability of BTECs in college has helped more people go to university than in the past. It's been a good way to advance social mobility. There has been a lot of discussion about whether they would be removed to make way for T-levels, and hopefully the government is backing down on what they said previously. But this would be very harmful for a significant number of students and would be damaging for social mobility. The longer term challenges in this area is to address narrowness of educational provision. This is an issue for academic education as well as for vocational education. We've heard Stuart talking about how differently the world is going to be. It has to be in the future compared to how it's been now. And this means that people need to have the foundational education to be able to train appropriately for the new things that become available. If you have too narrow an education between 16 and 18, you're simply not equipped to do that. And the narrowness is also an issue in apprenticeship standards. We have over twice as many apprenticeship standards as in Germany, and this means that people are educated to work in particular jobs, but they're not very well educated in apprenticeships if they want to move between jobs in similar areas. Adult skills is a huge issue of all the areas of education. Education spending has reduced in real terms over time, but in the last 10 years, government spending on adult education is 50% lower than it was. One of the ways this is manifest is that adults find it difficult to get financial support for study if they need to retrain. And there have been some government reforms, planned reforms to try to address that. But if you are somebody, for example, with an A level, but you want to retrain to do something different, you will not get government funding to be able to retrain at that level, even under the new reforms. That is much less generous than many other countries. In addition to the fact that FE colleges don't have enough funding, their funding rules are also complex and inflexible, and this means they can't really do long-term planning. So even, for example, if they would want to put on STEM courses, they may not be able to plan over a long-term horizon, and those courses are also quite expensive to put on. So that's a reason why they're not provided at greater scale than they are. And also spending for retraining is not just about government expenditure, it's also about private sector investment, but you do need to incentivize that. Firms are incentivized to invest in capital much more than they are incentivized to invest in people. You could address this through the tax system. For example, you could introduce human capital tax credits that work a bit like R&D tax credits, which would go some way to address this. But providing incentives for apprenticeship is no way enough for what's needed. And finally, of course, in any levelling up agenda, there is an important role for regional policy. Most obviously, to my mind, in the case for adults for retraining and skilling. And it is important to do that in the context of an economic plan. So you need to look at what the demand for skills are, rather than just decide you need to have more skills and put on courses that maybe bear no relation to what's needed in the local area. Adults who need retraining often need more specific and short-term training than those at the outset of their career. So they're beyond the stage of foundational education, and they actually need to do training that's more geared to a particular job. So that means providing something different for adults than you do provide for young people. There have been some well-documented success of sectoral training programs in the United States, and the kinds of characteristics they have is that they're geared towards the needs of local employers. They're managed by community organizations or private agencies. They entail training in specific occupational and soft skills as well. Soft skills are often overlooked. People sometimes talk about high-level technical skills, and although those things are important, there are returns to soft skills as well, and that's something that is important to invest in. And then finally, these programs also involve follow-up with services after job placement to ensure that employees get a sufficient wage, because people will not engage in retraining, especially not as adults, if they really don't think it's worth their while. I'll stop there.